A young black woman was forced into marriage with a wealthy older man. On their wedding night, when she saw her newlywed husband step out of the bathroom, she was too shocked to speak. "Eleanor, get up. You'll be late for school." Her mother's voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the urgency in it. In their house, time was measured in sacrifices. Every second spent sleeping was a second lost working, surviving, trying to scrape together enough to see another day. Eleanor pushed off the thin blanket and sat up. The cold morning air bit at her skin, but she was used to it. Their little shack, nothing more than a patched-up wooden frame with plastic sheets for windows, did little to keep out the chill. Across the room, her brother Isaiah was already dressed, tying his worn-out sneakers with careful precision. The soles had been glued back more times than she could count, but they still had a few more months left in them, maybe. Their parents had been up long before sunrise. Her father had left for the docks, where he'd spend the day hauling crates for men who barely acknowledged him. Her mother was outside, arranging the few vegetables she had managed to get on credit from the street vendor. Elena stood up, smoothing down her faded shirt. She had to get to school, because school was the only way out. Life in their neighborhood wasn't just hard. It was unforgiving. The small town in the deep south had never been kind to families like hers. Black folks weren't wanted here, not really. They were tolerated so long as they kept their heads down, did the work nobody else wanted, and never expected more. Elena had learned that lesson young. She had watched her father swallow his pride 1,000 times, nodding respectfully to men who called him boy, though he was pushing 50. She had seen her mother count pennies with shaking hands, trying to make a dollar stretch beyond its limits. She had seen Isaiah, who once dreamed of becoming an engineer, come home with bruises on his ribs after yet another fight at school. But the hardest part wasn't the poverty. It was the way people looked at them, as if they were stuck in a place they had no right to leave. "You're a smart girl, Elena," her teacher, Mrs. Carter, had told her once. "But smart won't change where you come from." She never forgot that. She studied hard, even when her stomach was empty, even when the whispers followed her down the hallways. "She thinks she's better than us. She gonna end up like the rest of them. No point, she ain't got the money for college." She ignored them. And then, one day, something impossible happened. A letter arrived, thick and official-looking. The kind of letter that didn't belong in their neighborhood. She opened it with trembling hands. Full scholarship, tuition, housing, books, everything. For the first time in her life, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. The night before she left for college, her mother sat beside her on the small mattress they shared. "You do this. You don't look back," she whispered. "You go. You make something of yourself. You don't let this place pull you down." Elena nodded, but there was a lump in her throat. Leaving meant freedom, but it also meant leaving them behind. Her father was quiet that night. He just squeezed her shoulder before going to bed. Isaiah, though, was angry. "You think a piece of paper's going to change things?" he snapped. "They ain't ever going to let you be one of them." She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she would prove them all wrong. But deep down, she wasn't sure. So instead, she hugged him. And the next morning she left. College was a different world. For the first time, she had her own bed. A room with a lock on the door, hot showers, a library with more books than she had ever seen in her life. But it wasn't easy. She was one of the few black students on campus, and people made sure she knew it. Professors who questioned if she really belonged. Classmates who assumed she was only there because of a diversity quota. She worked twice as hard. She sat at the front of the class, took notes until her hand ached, read every book, memorized every formula. She would not fail. She could not fail. 4 years passed in a blur. The day she walked across that stage, diploma in hand, she felt something crack inside her. She had done it, but there was no time to celebrate. Because a degree didn't pay bills, and back home, her family was still struggling. So she took the first job she could find. Cashier. Not what she had dreamed of, but it was something. A paycheck. A way to send money home. She told herself it was temporary. That one day she'd have an office, a title, a life where she didn't have to count every cent. But deep down, she feared the truth. That no matter how hard she tried, she would always be running. That no matter how far she went, the past would always be one step behind. The past followed her like a shadow, stretching long in the fading light, refusing to disappear no matter how fast she walked. Elena had told herself that a degree would be her escape, a golden key to a new life where she would be judged by her ambition, not by the weight of her last name or the rusted tin roof of the house she grew up in. But the world was not as simple as that. The name on her diploma carried little weight in the eyes of men who asked, almost casually, about where she was from, where her people were from, what her father did for a living. And when she answered, she saw the shift, the flicker of hesitation in their smiles, the polite but sudden distance, as if they had just realized she was something fragile, something cracked beneath the surface. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe the men she met were just busy or uninterested for reasons that had nothing to do with her past. But after the 5th time, the 10th time, the 100th time, she could no longer ignore the pattern. It always started the same way. A charming smile, warm eyes, a voice dipped in admiration. She was intelligent, hard-working, beautiful in a way that wasn't loud or demanding. They would take her out to nice restaurants, hold the door open for her, laugh at her dry humor. She let herself believe, just a little, that maybe this time would be different. But then the questions would come. Soft at first, almost teasing. "You didn't grow up around here, did you?" Or sometimes blunt. "Where'd you go to high school?" And if she answered truthfully, if she told them about the small town where people still whispered behind cupped hands, where her mother sold vegetables on the corner and her father broke his back lifting crates, their interest would dim like a candle in the wind. "Oh," they would say. Just that. Just "oh." And then the calls slowed. The texts became shorter. Until finally, silence. She had thought, foolishly, that men in the city would be different, that the educated, well-dressed ones who spoke about politics and progress would not be the kind to turn their noses up at a woman whose mother still counted pennies at the grocery store. But in the end, their polite rejection was no different than the blunt dismissals she had seen back home. She tried to act like it didn't matter, that she wasn't looking for love anyway, that she was too busy, too focused on building a life for herself. But the truth was, it stung. Every time, it stung. It was worse for her brother. Isaiah had always been the stubborn one, the one who refused to let the world tell him who he was. But even his shoulders had started to sag under the weight of rejection. "It's different for you," he told her one night, after yet another woman had politely declined a second date. "You're a woman. A man can take care of you. But me?" He shook his head. "Nobody wants to struggle with a broke man." She wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. A man's worth was tied to what he could provide, and Isaiah had little more than his hands and a head full of dreams. And dreams didn't pay the bills. The whispers followed them wherever they went. The people back home never said it to her face, but she could hear them all the same. She thinks she's better than us. She got that fancy degree, but what good has it done her? She'll end up alone, just like the rest of them. She told herself she didn't care. But some nights, when the weight of it all pressed down on her, she found herself wondering if they were right. If, no matter how hard she tried, she would always be the girl from the wrong side of town, standing on the outside looking in. And then, one evening, her mother came home with a letter. She was quiet when she set it down on the table, smoothing the creases with careful fingers. Her father stood behind her, his face unreadable. Isaiah leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Elena," her mother said, voice low. "There's a man." She blinked. "A man?" Her mother nodded. "He sent this." She tapped the envelope. Elena picked it up hesitantly. The paper was thick, expensive. Her stomach twisted as she unfolded it and began to read. The words blurred before her eyes, but the meaning was clear. He was wealthy, respected, a businessman with land, properties, investments, and he wanted to marry her. Her hands trembled as she set the letter down. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I don't even know him." Her mother's voice was barely above a whisper. "His name is Mr. Noah." Elena's head snapped up. The name carried weight even in their small town. Everyone knew of him, the elusive businessman, the man who owned half the county but was rarely seen. 60 years old, wealthy beyond imagination, powerful enough to turn fortunes with a single decision. And now he had chosen her. Her stomach twisted. "He wants to meet you," her father said, rubbing the back of his neck. His voice was measured, but there was something beneath it, something weary. Elena felt Isaiah's gaze burning into her. He hadn't said a word since the letter arrived, but she knew his silence held more weight than any argument he could have made. She swallowed hard. "Why?" Her mother flinched, just slightly. He says he admires you, that he's looking for a wife who is strong, loyal, and family-oriented. Elena let out a slow breath, steadying herself. The words were flattering, but she knew better than to believe them. Men like Mr. Noah didn't make decisions based on admiration. They made deals. "He's been sending things," her father added quietly. And just like that, as if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Elena's mother rushed to open it, revealing 2 men standing outside, their faces unreadable. They carried large sacks, rice, flour, oil, things that had always been in short supply in their home. The scent of fresh produce drifted in from the woven baskets they placed on the ground. "For the family," one of them said simply before turning and walking away. Elena's mother stood frozen, one hand over her mouth. Her father only nodded, stepping aside to let the men place the goods inside. Elena watched. Her heart beat, a steady thrum in her ears. The weight of it all settled into her bones. This wasn't just a proposal. It was a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, her mother wouldn't have to count coins at the market, deciding between vegetables and rice. Her father wouldn't have to pretend he wasn't skipping meals so she and Isaiah could eat. And it wasn't just the food. She thought of the letter, of the whispered conversations between her parents that had grown more frequent lately, of the way her father winced when he moved, the weight of years and hard labor pressing into his bones. She thought of the medical papers she had found by accident one evening while cleaning, his diagnosis scrawled in sharp, unfeeling letters. He needed surgery that cost more than their family had seen in a lifetime. She closed her eyes. She had worked so hard to build a future for herself. to escape the expectations that had shackled generations before her. And yet, here she was, faced with a choice that had never truly been hers to make. Her mother's voice cut through her thoughts. "Elena, please," she whispered. "Just meet him." 2 days later, she sat across from him. The restaurant was quiet, the kind of place where people whispered instead of talked. Everything about it felt expensive, from the soft leather of the chairs to the candlelight flickering against polished wood. Mr. Noah was exactly as she had imagined. A man accustomed to power. His suit was tailored to perfection, his silver hair neatly combed back. He didn't look fragile. There was a strength in the way he carried himself, a presence that filled the space between them. His eyes, sharp, assessing, studied her with something unreadable. "I imagine this must be overwhelming," he said, his voice smooth, measured. Eleanor gripped the stem of her water glass, willing herself to stay composed. "It is." He nodded, as if he respected her honesty. "I won't insult you by pretending this is something it's not," he continued. "I need a wife, and your family needs security." She tensed at his bluntness. "I won't force you into anything," he added, "but I will make sure you understand what I'm offering." A pause. Then, in a voice that held no hesitation, "Marriage to me means stability, comfort, a home where you will never have to struggle again." Eleanor let the words settle over her. They were carefully chosen, devoid of the warmth one might expect from a proposal. This was a contract. "You don't know me," she said finally. "No," he agreed, "but I've learned enough." She exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "What do you expect from me?" He didn't flinch. Loyalty, respect, a wife who understands the value of discretion. Her fingers tightened around her glass. "And love?" He let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no real amusement in it. "Love," he mused. "Love is a luxury, Eleanor. I won't lie to you. I don't expect love. I expect partnership." The words settled deep in her chest, pressing against something fragile. She thought of her mother's tired hands, her father's labored breathing, Isaiah's silent disappointment. And then she thought of herself, of the little girl who had once dreamed of a life where she was more than just someone's obligation. Mr. Noah reached into his pocket, pulled out an envelope, and placed it on the table between them. "I took the liberty of scheduling your father's surgery," he said. "The cost has been covered, regardless of your decision." Elena's breath caught. She stared at the envelope, at the quiet finality of it. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "When do you want an answer?" His expression remained unchanged. "Take your time, but not too long." She nodded, pushing back the lump in her throat. The weight of her choice settled over her. She had always known that life was not kind to women like her, but she had never thought it would come to this. The morning of her wedding, Elena stood in front of the mirror, staring at a reflection that no longer felt like her own. The dress was simple, white but not pure, the fabric worn, the lace soft with age. It had been borrowed from a distant cousin, adjusted hastily by her mother's trembling hands. No satin, no beading, no flowing train. Just enough to look respectable, just enough to look like a bride. But she didn't feel like one. A bride should be glowing. A bride should be breathless with excitement, trembling with joy, not dread. But as Elena traced the outline of her own face in the mirror, all she saw was a woman standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. Her mother adjusted the veil over her head, fingers lingering on her shoulders. "You look beautiful," she whispered. but there was sorrow in her voice, thick and heavy, pressing into the small space between them. Eleanor swallowed. She wanted to believe her. But beautiful was not the word for what she felt. She felt empty. The ceremony was held in the grand estate of Mr. Noah, beneath towering oak trees and under the watchful eyes of people who did not know her, who would not have cared for her had she not been chosen. Servants moved quietly, arranging chairs and flowers, but no one spoke to her. They glanced at her, eyes flickering with curiosity, pity, indifference. She was not a bride to be celebrated. She was an agreement made flesh. Mr. Noah stood at the altar, his figure tall and unmoving, a stark contrast to the nervous energy buzzing in her veins. He looked exactly as he had when she first met him, precisely put together, his suit sharp, his posture unwavering. There was no nervousness in him, no hesitation. He had made this decision long ago. She, on the other hand, felt like she was walking toward a life that did not belong to her. The officiant began to speak, his voice solemn, weighty with the gravity of the moment. Eleanor barely heard the words. She felt her father's presence behind her, a heavy hand on her back, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle. She felt the wind move through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else, something final. And then the question came. Do you, Elena, take Mr. Noah to be your lawfully wedded husband? Her lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. She thought of her mother's tired hands, her father's weary sigh, Isaiah's silence. She thought of the hospital bill that would no longer exist, of the food on the table, of the relief she had seen in her father's eyes when she had told him her decision. She had already chosen. The words were only a formality now. I do. Her voice barely carried past her lips, but it didn't matter. Mr. Noah nodded once, his expression unreadable. He slipped a ring onto her trembling finger, and just like that it was done. There were no cheers, no applause, only the rustling of leaves in the wind, the quiet murmur of onlookers already turning their attention elsewhere. A deal had been made, a contract sealed. Elena belonged to him now. The ride to her new home was silent. Mr. Noah sat beside her in the back seat of the car, his posture relaxed, hands resting on his lap. He did not try to speak to her, did not acknowledge the way her fingers twisted together in her lap, or the way she kept stealing glances at him, trying to understand the man she had just married. It felt strange, sitting beside him like this, close yet worlds apart. The estate loomed in the distance, a mansion that had existed long before she was born and would remain long after she was gone. It was beautiful, but cold, like something out of a story she did not belong in. As the car pulled through the gates, her stomach tightened. This was her home now, a house she had never stepped foot in, a bed she had never slept in, a man she did not know. Elena sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers curled into the silk sheets, trying to steady her breath. The bedroom was massive, too grand, too foreign, too much like something out of a dream she had never asked for. It smelled of polished wood and fresh linen, everything too clean, too untouched, as if it had been waiting for her arrival. The weight of the evening settled over her, pressing down on her chest, making each inhale feel heavier than the last. Beyond the thick wooden door, the sound of running water filled the silence. Mr. Noah had been in the bathroom for over an hour, and with each passing minute her unease grew. At first, she told herself that maybe he was simply taking his time, giving her a moment to adjust. Perhaps despite everything, he was a man of patience, someone who understood the discomfort of a young bride bound to a husband she did not love. But as the clock ticked on, Doubt crept in. Was he unwell? Had something happened? She tried to push away the worst thoughts, but her body betrayed her, tension tightening in her limbs. She rose to her feet, hesitant but determined, and stepped toward the door, hand hovering over the handle. Just as she was about to knock, the door creaked open. Steam poured into the room, thick and curling, clouding her vision for a moment. She squinted against the haze, expecting to see the frail, silver-haired man she had married, the one whose ring now sat on her finger like a shackle she had willingly placed upon herself. But as the mist cleared, her body went rigid. The man who stepped out was not the aging businessman she had exchanged vows with that morning. His damp hair clung to his forehead, dark and untouched by time. His face, striking and sharp, was nothing like the wrinkled one she had studied at the wedding altar. His body, lean and strong, was covered only by a towel draped low around his waist, revealing broad shoulders and a presence far too commanding for a man of 60. Elena stumbled back, her heart hammering so violently that it was a wonder she could still breathe. Who are you?" she forced out, barely recognizing her own voice. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, yet strangely familiar. "Elena," he said, his voice steady, measured. Her stomach twisted. That voice. She knew that voice. It was Mr. Noah's. Elena's hands trembled as she took another step back, her legs stiff with fear and disbelief. She shook her head, as if denying the reality before her would change it. "No, this isn't real," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The man, this stranger, exhaled, as though he had anticipated this reaction. "It is real." She swallowed hard, her body screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. "You're lying," she said, the words spilling out not because she believed them, but because she needed them to be true. "Elena, I am Noah." The room blurred at the edges. His words were clear, firm, yet impossible. Her heart pounded against her ribs, the weight of the moment suffocating. "You expect me to believe that?" she snapped, voice sharp with a mix of panic and anger. "That the man I married, the man who stood at the altar, was what? Wearing a disguise?" "Yes," he answered simply, his expression unreadable. The simplicity of it, the certainty in his tone, sent a shiver down her spine. It was not a joke. Not some cruel trick her mind had conjured up in its desperation to make sense of this. He was serious. She clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. "Why?" His gaze didn't waver. "Because I needed to know who you really were." The absurdity of it all struck her at once, a bitter laugh slipping past her lips. "So, you pretended to be an old man," she said, the words dripping with disbelief, "to test me?" "I needed to see if you were truly the woman I was told you were." She inhaled sharply, her chest tightening. "And who told you that?" For the first time since the conversation had begun, his expression shifted, something softer flickering in his eyes. "Someone you once helped." Confusion twisted inside her. "Helped?" she repeated, her mind racing through distant memories, trying to grasp at something that fit. Noah watched her carefully, as if waiting for the realization to dawn on her. And then, like a puzzle finally snapping into place, she remembered. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid, as though it had been waiting for this moment to remind her of its existence. A cold evening, rain tapping lightly against the store window. A man, frail and weary, standing at the counter, struggling to count his coins with trembling fingers. His clothes had been old but clean, his hands marked with age and hardship. She had watched as frustration crept into his features, his lips pressing together in embarrassment, when he realized he was short on change. Without a second thought, she had reached into her pocket and covered the cost. It had been nothing to her, a simple kindness. But now, standing in this grand room, staring at the young man who claimed to be her husband, she realized it had been everything. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your grandfather." Noah nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes." Eleanor's chest tightened as the weight of it all settled over her. He was testing me? In a way, Noah admitted, his gaze unwavering. He spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Money, power, influence. But that day, you saw only a man who needed help, not a man who could offer you something in return. A bitter laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. And so what? He decided right then that I was good enough to be your wife. Noah exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. It wasn't like that. Then explain it to me, she snapped, anger lacing her words. Because from where I'm standing, it sounds exactly like that. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Before he died, he made me promise I would find you, that I would at least consider marrying you. But I didn't want an arranged marriage, Elena. I didn't want to be bound to someone because of obligation. She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. And yet here we are. His jaw tightened. I needed to know who you really were. Not just the girl my grandfather spoke about, not just the kind stranger in the store. I needed to see the woman you had become, to understand if... He stopped himself, his hands clenching at his sides. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. If what? If you were worth loving, he said finally, his voice quieter, more raw than she had ever heard it. The words knocked the breath from her lungs. Worth loving. Not just a good woman, not just a kind stranger, but someone who deserved love. Her heart pounded against her ribs, confusion and anger battling inside her. You pretended to be someone else, she said, her voice tight. You let me believe I was marrying an old man, forced me to accept a future I didn't want. And now, you expect me to just, what? Understand? Noah's expression softened, though pain lingered behind his eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, she whispered. A heavy silence settled between them. Noah sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know you feel like you had no choice, that you were forced into this. She let out a bitter laugh. That's exactly what happened. But you're wrong. His voice was firm, unwavering. You did have a choice, Elena. You could have said no. Elena's eyes burned as frustration clawed at her chest. You don't understand. Then make me understand. She inhaled sharply, her throat tightening. I couldn't say no, she said, each word trembling with emotion. Not when my father needed surgery. Not when my mother looked at me like I was their last hope. Not when the world has spent my entire life telling me that women like me don't get happy endings. Noah's face darkened, something flickering in his gaze. Guilt, maybe, or something deeper. You think I don't know that? She crossed her arms, her body rigid. You don't. You couldn't. I do, he insisted. That's why I needed to be sure. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her head pounding from the weight of it all. And now that you are... His gaze held hers, steady, unwavering. I want you to stay. Her heart twisted. And if I don't? A muscle in his jaw ticked, but he didn't look away. Then you go. She blinked, taken aback. I won't stop you, he continued. I won't trap you in a life you don't want. If you decide to leave, I'll make sure your family is taken care of. You'll never have to worry about them again. Elena's breath hitched. It was a promise, one she hadn't expected, one that should have made the decision easy. If she left, she could be free, and her family would still be safe. But something about the way he looked at her, the way he had laid out the truth, his truth, without excuse or manipulation, made her hesitate. Noah took a step closer, closing the space between them. "But if you stay, Elena, I want it to be because you choose me. Not because you feel like you owe me something. Not because you're afraid of what happens if you walk away." She stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. He was giving her an out, a chance to rewrite her future. Elena turned and walked away before Noah could say another word. She needed space, needed air, needed distance from the man who had turned her world upside down, with nothing more than the truth. Her footsteps echoed through the long hallways of the mansion, her pulse loud in her ears. Everything about this place was too grand, too quiet, too foreign. She had spent her entire life scraping by, living in a home where the walls were thin enough to hear her parents whisper about overdue bills, where the floorboards creaked under the weight of too many sacrifices. Now she was surrounded by wealth, luxury that had come at a cost she wasn't sure she was willing to pay. She wandered aimlessly, her fingers grazing the polished wood of furniture that probably cost more than her entire childhood home. Chandeliers cast golden light over the marble floors. Oil paintings of people she did not know lined the walls, their expressions frozen in time. This was Noah's world, a world of power, of privilege, of choices she had never been allowed to make for herself. And yet, he had given her one now. She could leave. The thought rattled inside her like a restless bird. She could walk away from all of this, return to the life she knew, to the people who were waiting for her. But if she did, what then? Her father's hospital bills had already been paid. Her family would be taken care of. But she had nothing else. No home, no job, no future that she had built for herself. If she walked away, she would be free. But free to do what? To go back to a world that had never truly accepted her. To face the whispers, the pitying looks, the silent judgment of a town that had always expected her to fail. She wrapped her arms around herself as she stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The estate stretched out before her, acres of land disappearing into the darkness. A world both beautiful and suffocating. She closed her eyes, trying to quiet the storm inside her. She thought of her mother, whose tired hands had packed her bags the night before she left for college, whispering, "Make something of yourself, Elena." She thought of Isaiah, his voice bitter as he told her, "People like us don't get choices." And she thought of Noah. Noah, who had deceived her, who had tested her like she was nothing more than a puzzle to be solved. But also Noah, who had looked her in the eye and told her that if she left, he would not stop her, that he would not trap her, that he wanted her to choose. Could she trust that? Could she trust him? She heard his footsteps before she saw him. She didn't turn around, but she felt his presence beside her, solid and quiet. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he broke the silence. "I know you're angry." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "That doesn't even begin to cover it." He nodded, accepting her words. "I don't regret what I did," he admitted, "but I regret hurting you." Elena opened her eyes, staring out into the night. "I don't know how to believe you." Noah leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. I don't expect you to. Not yet. She turned to look at him then, searching his face for any sign of deception. But for the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain, vulnerable even. What do you want from me, Noah? He inhaled slowly. I want you to stay. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced herself to push past it. Because you feel guilty? Because your grandfather made you promise? His expression darkened. No. Because I want you. Her breath hitched. Noah exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I've spent my life surrounded by people who only see what I can give them. And for a long time, I thought that was all there was. That love, trust, all of it was just another kind of transaction. But then I met you. She stiffened. You didn't meet me, Noah. You studied me. You tested me. I did, he admitted. And in the process, I fell in love with you. The words hung between them, heavy, undeniable. Elena swallowed hard, her emotions tangled and messy. You don't love me, she said, shaking her head. You love the idea of me. The woman your grandfather told you about, the girl in the store who handed him a bag of groceries and forgot about it the next day. Noah's gaze sharpened. You think I don't know the difference? She turned away, gripping the railing. I don't know what to think anymore. A breeze swept through the balcony, carrying the scent of night jasmine. Noah's voice was softer when he spoke again. I know I don't deserve your trust, and I know that nothing I say right now is going to change how you feel. He hesitated before continuing. So, I won't ask for an answer tonight. Take your time. Think about what you want, not what anyone else expects from you. If you decide to leave, I won't stop you. And if you stay, he trailed off, his voice raw. If you stay, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that this wasn't just a game to me. Eleanor spent days lost in thought, wandering through the grand estate, observing Noah in a way she hadn't before. Now that the anger had settled into something quieter, something less consuming. She allowed herself to see him, not as the man who had deceived her, not as the stranger she had been forced to marry, but simply as himself. She watched him in moments when he thought no one was looking. The way he carried himself, not with the arrogance of a man born into privilege, but with the quiet patience of someone who had learned that power meant little without purpose. She noticed the way he spoke to the staff, not as servants but as people, asking about their families, remembering their names. She saw the weight he carried, the loneliness he masked behind his calm exterior, the years of expectation that had shaped him into someone who struggled to trust, who had needed to test her before he could believe in something real. And she realized, despite everything, Noah had never once tried to control her. He had given her the choice, had promised to let her go if that was what she wanted. No manipulation, no demands, no guilt. That was more than any man before him had ever given her. She had spent her whole life fighting to prove her worth, to make people see her as more than her past. But Noah, despite his mistakes, despite his misguided way of finding her, had never questioned her worth at all. And that changed everything. One morning, just as the sun began to rise, Elena walked into Noah's office, her heart steady in a way it hadn't been in weeks. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing papers, but the moment she stepped inside, he looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. She didn't hesitate. She had spent too long hesitating. "You can look however you want," she said, her voice even, sure. "Old or young, rich or poor, none of that matters." She took a step closer, meeting his gaze. "What matters is whether or not your heart is real. For the first time since she had met him, Noah seemed truly taken aback. His lips parted slightly, his usually unreadable face shifting into something raw, something almost vulnerable. Then, slowly, a smile broke across his face. Not the polite, measured kind he had perfected over the years, but something real, something unguarded. He stood, closing the distance between them, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. Elena sank into the embrace, allowing herself to believe, fully, truly, that this was real. There were no more secrets between them, no more tests, no more barriers. Only two people who had walked through fire and come out on the other side, together. They had found each other in the most unexpected way, and despite everything, despite the lies, the anger, the heartbreak, what remained was something neither of them had ever truly had before. A love that was honest, a love that was chosen, a love that was real. And this time, it was enough. From that day on, life no longer felt like something Eleanor had to endure. It was something she could finally live. The estate, once a place that felt too large, too cold, slowly became a home. Not because of its size or beauty, but because of the man who lived inside it. The man who had once been a stranger, but was now something much more. Noah kept his promise. He never rushed her, never asked for more than she was willing to give. Instead, he showed her every day in small ways that she had made the right choice. She found herself laughing more, something she had forgotten she knew how to do. She found comfort in the quiet moments they shared, the way he would pour her tea in the mornings, the way his hand would find hers when they walked through the garden. And slowly, without even realizing it, she fell in love. Not with the wealth, not with the security, but with the man. The one who had been flawed, who had made mistakes, but who had never stopped trying to prove that he was worthy of her. And in the end, he was. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that was enough for forever. Eleanor's journey is one of resilience, sacrifice, and self-discovery. From the beginning, she is a woman shaped by hardship, forced to make impossible choices for the sake of her family. Her decision to marry a man she does not love is heartbreaking yet deeply noble, reflecting the reality many people face when duty outweighs personal desires. However, what makes her journey truly compelling is not just her suffering, but her strength, her ability to endure, to question, and ultimately to take control of her own destiny. Noah, despite his deception, is not a cruel man, but a flawed one, shaped by his own fears and distrust of the world. His journey is about learning to love authentically, to trust without conditions, and to earn, not demand, someone's heart. The story carries a powerful message about love, choice, and integrity. It teaches that true love is not built on appearances or wealth, but on mutual respect and sincerity. It reminds us that while fate may bring two people together, only honesty and trust can keep them there. In the end, Eleanor does not just find love. She finds agency, proving that even in the face of adversity, one can still choose happiness on their own terms. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.